My baby dolls, we are back again. Postseason play is well underway in the 2017 season. My Yankees got crushed by the Indians last night. Boston got crushed by Houston. And, tonight they play again, and I think the Chicago Cubs and the Nationals take center stage tonight for the National League. And, hey, it's going to be real exciting. I think it's going to be good matchups. But right now, we're talking a little dead ball baseball. Of course, as always, I'm your host, Ian Kahanowitz. Today, I got a hell of a show for you because we're talking about the Cubs and we're talking about the Athletics in 1910. And we have Richard Bressler, who authored the book. And you know something? He makes a great comparison, even in this title. One dynasty ends, another begins. We'll get into that. I like the segue in from the Chicago Cubs dynasties from, say, 1906 through 10, and then the Mac dynasty from, of course, 10 to 14. And you know something? In a comparison between the two of them, when you look at the 1906 World Series, when the White Sox beat the Cubs, Cubs were heavily favored. You know, I mean, let's face it, the White Sox couldn't really score. And so, the 1906 World Series, they had the lowest batting averages for both teams, and yet they eked out a 4-2 victory over the Cubs. And similarly, in 1914, and we'll have author Charles Alexander on the show on November 2nd, the Miracle Braves. They beat a heavily favored, Philadelphia Athletics team, and part of the mystique about that whole thing is that the 1914 Athletics was still a part of this, dynasty that starts in 1910, and then County Mac didn't really have a winner until the late 20s and early 30s when they went to the World Series, and the second Mac dynasty was, in the books. But hey, you're on the Zigzag Man's network, the Comfortably Zone Radio Network. Again, the Zigzag Man. He's bringing a lot of shows to you guys. Ralph Tycho, he's on with Hal Bach on Vintage Sports. He's on Golenbach University with Peter Golenbach. We got Nancy Finley doing Oakland A's baseball. We got Bill Kashanis doing Philadelphia baseball. We got Mark Littell and Mark Weiss doing Mark and Mark in the Midday. There is so many shows out there. I cannot begin to tell you. Go to the website, go to YouTube, go to Spreaker, go to iTunes, download some of these podcasts. We're all in the same boat and trying to give you listeners a learning experience and an enjoyable one in and that. I mean, not everyone's as colorful as me, but then again, you don't have to be. Look at Al Blumpkin and author David Finoli. They do the Pittsburgh Pirates, a brand new show, and you don't have to be colorful to get knowledge. I mean, I make it fun because hey, I'm a tax lawyer, and when you do tax, stuff gets under your skin. I've been doing it for 20 years, and you become a little nuts. Now, speaking of nuts, the guy out in Las Vegas, I think I mentioned on my last two shows, he was an accountant. So when people say to me, well, Ian, you're an accountant and a lawyer, well, what do you say about him? I said, well, they can't find the motive, but I'll tell you, after doing this stuff for 40 years like he did, and the numbers and tax get under your skin with clients who really don't listen to you, you become a little nuts. And I'm telling you, if anyone understands the Internal Revenue Code, you come speak to me, and I'll buy them a drink because I'm in the same boat. I actually understand it. So it's like learning Greek. But who is Richard Bressler? And, of course, Richard Bressler is a retired financial professional. I'll even go as far as say he's an ex-IRS agent. We won't hold that against him. And he has written 2 books about medieval history. And, again, most of you know I have my master's in history as well as my law degree and my master's in tax and accounting. And medieval history, I had a professor back in college at Brooklyn College. His name was Teo Ruiz. He was one of the best professors voted in the CUNY, which is the City University of New York, and he made medieval history fun. And he is still, after 27 years, stands out in my mind as just enlightening me of the whole period. So, I mean, go research Richard's books and, take a look at it. I mean, it's great. He lives in Champaign, Illinois, and you know what? That's the home of the University of Illinois. And without any further ado, welcome to the show, Richard.
Thank you very much, Ian. I'm glad to be here.
I hope I didn't butcher you too much.
Not too much, no. The only thing that I would say is that I did write 2 books on medieval history. One has been published and is available on Frederick II, and the other one has been submitted to the same publisher that published the Cubs and the A's book, McFarland, and they intend to bring it out. I just don't know when yet. But it has been written, so it's not an incorrect statement to say that I wrote 2 books.
Well, this is what I would do, because I'm finishing a book on the whole Tris Speaker and Ty Cobb affair, and what I'm doing, I'm going shopping. I'm going to University of Nebraska Press, I'm going to McFarland, I'm going to Princeton, because I have people like you on my show who know people on the inside, and if they like my shows and they like my sites and they like my kind of, I always submit like a sample of my chapters. Then that's right. They say, hey, you got to submit a proposal. Look, I'll write it in an email. I don't have to write a 25-page proposal. This is what it is. Here's a sample of my book. Here's my resume. You want to play or not? I mean, and then I'm going to have to negotiate the whole percentage thing,
Yep. Well, I commend your approach. It's probably a good way to do it. I'm someone who entered this, as you said, after a full career of doing something else, and I basically have just done it as a lark, and it's worked out. So, I've done it and submitted it to publishers, and they've taken it or they've not taken it, and that's where we go. One of the nice things about being a retired federal employee is you do have a decent pension, so you don't have to worry too much about the money side of it.
Wait a minute. Now, let me just know if I know correct, I had a lot of buddies. One of the things about, gaining some respect amongst the IRS folks is get to learn the inner workings of it. Now, you were probably on the old pension plan, which stated 83% of your salary in your retirement.
It could be that. I am on the old pension plan. It depends how many years you worked, and in my particular case, it turned out to be, I think, about 68%. But that's because I retired when I was 55. So
see all the big shots.
That's
you
right.
don't retire. You don't even retire. I retired at 45. I got sick with diabetes. I made my money when I was younger. So I'm 2 years into my retirement at 47. This is what I do. By the way, let me just say something. You wrote a great book. And you know why it's great? Because you educate people what happened before. A lot of people don't understand about the 19th century. They know of Connie Mack, but they don't know Connie Mack. They know of Frank Chance, but they don't know Frank Chance. You bring it out in your book. You're not overly verbose because the book's about 170 pages, 180 pages. Tell me, we'll start with Connie Mack. He is the man. Norman Mach wrote a 3-biography set on him from 2007 through 2012. One of the pioneers of baseball. What do you say about Connie Mack in the 19th century up to 1910?
Well, firstly, your reference of Norman Mach is who I used. Who educated me about Connie Mack? Because the book that I cite in my book is one of the biggest sources of the book is the first volume of Norman Mach's biography, which is Connie Mack in the Early Days of Baseball. A wonderful book, and it's really interesting when you think about it that Connie Mack was born in 1862. His father was fighting in the Civil War when he was born. So he was born in 1862. He died and he worked in baseball till 1950. And I would be willing to bet, although I don't know this, I would be willing to bet there is probably still somebody from his last team that's still alive. So, you have that connection going all the way back to the beginnings of baseball. And one of the things that was really neat about Connie Mack is when he first played baseball, it wasn't baseball. It was basically a form of cricket called four-o-cat. Baseball was in the process of being disseminated throughout the country. It hadn't gotten to his small town yet. It got there very soon after that. But, he runs the gamut from then until like I said, 1950. So he started off playing for his town team. Like I said, his father fought in the Civil War and became ill enough that he wasn't really able to work. And so Connie Mack and his brother, I think he had like 4 brothers, they all basically had to go to work when they were like 10 years old. And he started working then. He only went to school through, I think, the 8th grade, and started working full-time when he was 14. And by that time, he was already playing on the town team in East Brookfield, Massachusetts. And town teams was basically how people played back then. Of course, we're talking at that time, this is like 1876, 1877 when he was doing that. And he worked his way up from the town team through the minor leagues to the major leagues and became a major league player. My memory is about 1880, 1881, something like that. No, a little bit later than that, 1885, something like that. So, and then he played in the major leagues for a good while as a catcher, even though you look at pictures of him, the last position you'd think he'd play was catcher because he was a tall, thin man. But he played catcher, and he was basically a good field no-hit catcher through his career, which lasted a good while, and became a manager in 1895 with the Pittsburgh Pirates. Another interesting little work on that is that Connie Mack was involved in the Players League, which was the first attempt by the players to take over the game, which didn't work, but he was involved in it. And after the Players League, he was a free agent, and him and a couple of other free agents signed with Pittsburgh, and the other teams thought the Pittsburgh team was pirating their players, and they called them the Pirates, and that's how they got their nickname, which I thought was very interesting. I didn't know that when I learned this through the book. So he went there. Like I said, he was a catcher. He eventually got named manager. He was manager for 2 years. He said he wasn't very good as a manager because he didn't really know how to lead people. And then he went to the minors after he got fired. He got fired as a manager after 2 years. He went to the minors in Milwaukee. And again, another very interesting thing that I learned, I sort of knew this, but I learned it much more in the research, is what managers did back then. There was no such thing as a general manager. I think the first general manager was named in the mid-20s. So there was no such thing as a general manager. The manager did the general manager's job. The manager did the manager's job. The manager did the marketing job. The manager did everything. And when Connie Mack, depending on what the owner wanted him to do, and when Connie Mack went to Milwaukee, he basically did everything. The owner said, "You run it. We'll supply the money, we'll give you a budget, but you run it." And he did. And he did that for 3 or 4 years. And he said himself that's where he learned how to do it. That's where he learned how to become a manager. And he learned what his likes and dislikes were in Milwaukee as a minor league manager. He learned that he had been playing with these players in the 1880s and 1890s who were basically fit the stereotype of baseball players back then as being rough, tough, they drank too much, they weren't very nice people. He saw that the stereotype was somewhat true, not entirely true, but he felt that he could get players who were more educated and could do better, and he started to do that in Milwaukee. Just started to do it. But then Milwaukee was part of what was known then as the Western League. In 1900 became the American League. It was still a minor league, but it was called the American League. And then in 1901, when Van Johnson, who was the president of first the Western and the American League, said, "We're going to make the American League a major league," Connie Mack was one of his lieutenants. He was one of the people doing the hard work to get it done, going out finding people who had money, telling them how to spend the money, building ballparks, getting players. In between the 1900 and 1901 season, Connie Mack basically figured out who the players were going to be for 3 different teams, for his own team, for the Cleveland team, and for the Boston team. And the fellow who did the money for that was named Charles Summers, who was from Cleveland, but he just supplied money. He didn't really know anything about baseball, and Connie Mack was the guy who did it. He found where the ballpark should be in Cleveland. He found where the ballpark should be in Boston and in Philadelphia, and contracted them to be built and all of this stuff. So he did a real lot at that point. And but he became the owner of the A's. He became one of the owners of the A's. Van Johnson did some finagling, which I detail in the book. Got the press on his side by giving them 25% interest in the franchise, but then also told Connie Mack, you need a partner. He got a partner named Ben Scheib, who's when you talk about the dead ball, well, I'm sure we'll talk about Ben Scheib because he's really important in the dead ball and the lively ball. And so Ben Scheib was his partner. They became 50-50 partners when it last harmoniously until Scheib died. I think in the 20s. I think Scheib lived until the 20s. And then Connie Mack started after the off season was his focus went to the A's, which was the team he was half owner of, manager of, general manager of, chief cook and bottle washer. He did everything, and started building a team. And he, I think they finished third or fourth in the first year of the American League. They won the pennant the second year, which was amazing because their best player from 1901, who was Napoleon Lajoie, was the what's the word I'm looking for? You're an attorney, the defendant or something. He was the subject of the big lawsuit at that time about the reserve clause. Lajoie had been a Philly. He played for the A's in 1901. Had one of the best seasons ever in Major League history. And then the Phillies sued the A's to get the reserve clause applied, and that suit didn't get settled until the beginning of the 1902 season when the Phillies won the lawsuit, and Lajoie couldn't play for the A's. But it was a state lawsuit, so it only applied to the state of Pennsylvania. So they let Lajoie go, and he signed with Cleveland and couldn't play in Pennsylvania for a year. So
yeah, that's right.
So they, but he played with Cleveland, and then after that year, the AL and the NL made peace, and Lajoie could play anywhere. But Mack lost his best player, the best player in the league, at the beginning of 1902. After I think he played for a week because of a court case, and they won the pennant. The A's won the pennant in 1902. So he did a really good job of gathering people. One of whom was someone who was somebody he had sort of said he didn't want people like this anymore. One of whom was Rube Waddell, who was one of the more famous characters of baseball in the 1900s because he was somewhat of a loony. But he was a great player, and Mack knew how to handle him. So that happened then, and then they continued being good for most of the rest of the 1900s. They won the pennant again. And, of course, in 1902, there was no World Series because the AL and the NL were still at war. In 1903, there was a World Series, which was basically an informal World Series between the Pirates and the Reds, what are now the Pirates and the Red Sox. The Red Sox weren't called the Red Sox back then. But that was arranged between the two teams. The powers that be in baseball had nothing to do with it. And then in 1904, of course, there was the Giants and the Red Sox, and the Giants refused to play. They just said, the American League's no good, we're not playing. And again, because that year before had been informal, there was nothing to compel them to do it. And then after that, the blowback on the Giants was so much that both McGraw and Brush was the owner, said, okay, well, we got to make rules on this. And Brush actually made the rules for the World Series. They were for a long time known as the Brush rules. And in 1905, that was the first really official World Series that was run by Major League Baseball, run by the National Commission back then. And the A's won the pennant in 1905. They played the Giants in a World Series that is famous for a lot of things. First of all, every game was a complete game. Every game but one was a complete game. The A's had one game where they had to use the bullpen. Every game was a complete game, but for the Giants, they only used two pitchers in the whole series. The A's, every game was a shutout. It was a 5-game series. The Giants shut out the A's 4 times. The A's shut out the Giants once. And Mack knew that he had a good team at that point, but it was an older team. It was a bit of a rowdy team. He didn't think it could he thought that was the best they could do. was, winning the pennant, and he didn't think it was sustainable. So he started to replace people, and he started in 1906. He got Eddie Collins. In 1907, he got I think Jack Barry. He got a couple of other younger players. 1908, he got Frank Baker, and Stuffy McGinnis, and he had other players coming in, younger pitchers, because the basics of his staff were Eddie Plank and Chief Bender. They had been there since 1902. Then he got Jack Coombs, and he got a couple of other pitchers. So he built a team, and by 1909, they were back to being competitive. In 1909, they had a very tough pennant race with the Tigers, and lost. But that was the team that became the 1910 team. They were a team that was a little bit split. Their outfielders tended to be a little older. Their infielders were very young and great. I mean, they were, two of them were Hall of Famers. Two of them among the best players ever to play their position. Frank Baker is one of the best third basemen ever. Eddie Collins is one of the best second basemen ever. And he had a very good pitching staff. So he built up a very good team going into the 1910 season and was ready to go. He said before the year he thought they had a good chance of winning.
And it's funny because I'll mention three things here, and then we'll comment on Scheib over here. First of all, the 1904 series wasn't played because, let's face it, McGraw hated Van Johnson.
True.
Johnson chased him out with the Baltimore Orioles, the whole thing. He was trying to crack down on, rowdiness, and McGraw was one of them. So he defected to the Giants, hated Van Johnson, wanted nothing to do in the American League. And like you mentioned, there was a war going on. We're talking about a monopoly by the National League. They've survived, I think, 4 different attempts to overthrow them, like the Players League and a few other, even the American Association, which we'll get in soon with the Cubs, because they began, I believe, as the Chicago White Stockings.
That's correct.
In around 1871, I think you mentioned. But we'll get in with Cap Anson, and we'll go into a little detail how they were up to 1910. But also, in the 1903 series, like you said, it wasn't very formal. It was informal. They didn't even know if they would have another series after that because they just got done with the war.
Right.
I think that's very important. The Red Sox were called the Boston Americans. It was played here in Boston, where I'm up here, I live. It was played at the old Huntington Grounds field before Fenway Park, because Fenway Park didn't come around to 1912. In 1904, I think Philadelphia won the.
Boston won the American League. In
1904, huh?
Yeah. So Boston was the defending, world champions unofficially. They were unofficially the defending world champions, and the Giants wouldn't play them, like you said, for the reasons you said.
Now, also what's interesting is that, I'm, like I said before, I'm writing a book on the whole Ty Cobb. You mentioned the home run Baker incident in 1909, where Connie Mack just blew a gasket when Ty Cobb slid into third base.
Right.
And accidentally. It wasn't done on purpose. We find out later on in the brand new book by Charles Learson, Ty Cobb, A Terrible Beauty, that for years they thought that was done intentionally to spike him. When you look at what happened in pictures, you could see his Ty Cobb's foot is turned away trying to avoid home run Baker, but accidentally nicks him on the arm. He did not intentionally try to spike him, Connie Mack never blew a gasket like that. He is so soft-spoken. I think they had Lefty Grove on the team, and he was, this is later on in 19. He was blowing his stack, and he was always soft-spoken, Connie Mack. He's like, if you want to take the day off, relax, But those were important incidents because later on he would take both Tris Speaker and Ty Cobb after the whole scandal. Mack knew how to build a team, but he also knew his budget constraints. Now, that's where we get into Scheib. Let's talk about Scheib and his importance, not only for Scheib Park, but for building the A's as well.
Well, like I said, Scheib was very interesting. He was he was in sporting goods. That's where he made his money. And he was an equal partner. This is something that, he was an equal partner with a man named Reach. I forget Reach's first name. But it was called the Reach Sporting Goods Company. And they were 50-50 partners, and they started right after the Civil War. And they were a successful sporting goods company. And Scheib had been involved with the Philadelphia Athletics of the American Association. And it had not been successful. He lost some money. He didn't like it very much. But his partner, Reach, at about that same time, became an investor in the Phillies. And he became an investor with the Phillies with one other person, whose name escapes me right now. But this other person got 51% of the stock, and Reach got 49% of the stock. And Reach discovered after a while that it was like he had no stock because he had no say. Because the other guy had 51%, there was nothing he could do about it. So Reach told, when Dan Johnson and Connie Mack came to Scheib to ask him to invest in the A's, Scheib wasn't hot to trot right away, but he thought he'd check it out, and he went to his partner, Reach, and said, what about it? He said, well, if you're going to do it 50-50. Don't do it where you have a minority share because it's not a good idea. So Scheib thought about it some more, and he decided to do it 50-50. And he invested. And originally the money for the A's had come a little bit from Connie Mack. I think it was $2,500 he put in, and mostly from Charles Summers, who was this Cleveland millionaire who was a big financier of the American League when it started. Now, they used that money to just sort of as seed money, and then Scheib came in and put in some more money. He came in, I think, put in about $30,000 more. And Scheib built the ballpark. They had to build a ballpark from scratch in Philadelphia because there was a ballpark in Philadelphia, but it was the Phillies ballpark, and the Phillies weren't going to rent it to the A's because they were at war. So they had to build their own ballpark, which they built as they did back then, a frame ballpark with wooden seats. And they built the ballpark, and Scheib's seed money was what they were able to do, what they were able to use to get their players and such. Excuse me. And then then they did all right. In the first year, they actually made a profit in 1901, and they were able to pay Summers his money back. Summers had put in $7,500. They were able to pay him his money back. So then Scheib was there for that. He kept putting money in, but the team was profitable pretty much. I know that in 1901, the Phillies outdrew them slightly because the Phillies were good in 1901. The Phillies came in second in the National League, and the A's finished third or fourth. The Phillies outdrew them slightly, but in 1902, the A's won the pennant, and the Phillies fell back, so the A's outdrew the Phillies, and then that was pretty much the case for the rest of the 1900s, where the A's were a better team, and they outdrew the Phillies. So they were doing okay. They were making money. Because obviously the economics of baseball were way different back then than they are now. It was basically attendance and concessions and stuff like. There was no parking lot. There was no parking lot money because people didn't own cars. Because cars hadn't been invented yet on a mass scale. So they were profitable, and Scheib was involved in the business end of it. He really didn't get involved in the player end of it. If Mack had questions about the business, he would go to Scheib, get Scheib's advice. Scheib basically let Mack run the day-to-day stuff. If there was something he was interested in, he would take greater control of it. But that was basically what he did until, I think it was 1907. They had basically agreed on and said, let Scheib do it to build a new ballpark. Because, as I said, the old ballpark was what ballparks used to be back then, which were, and this was true all throughout the big leagues, it was true for the parks that survived, like the Polo Grounds, or I think there was one in Cleveland, there was one in St. Louis, they changed. At the time in the early 1900s and in the 1890s, these were wooden structures. And they had the problems one would get with a wooden structure. Sometimes they would collapse. Many of them caught fire and burned down. Scheib decided, okay, we've been here, we've done this for 5 or 6 years. It's a profitable business. Let's build a good ballpark. And he and Mac agreed upon doing it, and Mac basically let Scheib do it. He gave Scheib the initiative because Scheib was mostly supplying the money. Scheib had more savings than Mac did. Scheib was a richer person, but he was supplying the money. The down payment, I think they ended up spending $500,000 on the ballpark, and they had to put $200,000 in, and I think that $200,000 was mostly Scheib's money. They got a mortgage for some of the rest of it, and they issued bonds for some of the rest of it. But Scheib did the deal. He was the one that went out and hired real estate people. They picked a spot, which of course was owned by lots of different people. Scheib was the one who bought the land and kept it secret, because if you know that there's going to be a ballpark in the neighborhood, as you know, the value is going to go up. So they wanted to keep it secret. Scheib was the one that worked with the city to zone the property so that he could, not have streets go through where there were streets going through now and stuff like that. And he did it. And then when it came time to design the ballpark, he brought Mac in saying, what do we need? Certain things that we need. But Scheib was the one that handled it. He did, he dealt with the contractors. He oversaw the construction. He did all of that stuff. And that was basically the first concrete and steel ballpark that was built in the big leagues. And it started the start of the 1909 season, 1 year before the book that I wrote takes place. So it was a big deal. That was the first one that was done in that way. And it was mostly Ben Scheib. He was the one, he was the visionary that came up with that. And as I've read in many other places, other people looked at it. They looked at him while he was building it, and they looked at it when it was done, and they said, okay, we can do this. It's not going to break us. We can afford it. And the money coming in baseball is a good enough business that we can make money to pay off the mortgage and pay off the bonds. And so let's do it. And from 1909 through basically 1916, I think, that was when all of the ballparks that were the ballparks of my youth in the late 50s and early 60s, that was when they were basically all built. That was when Forbes Field was built. That was when the Polo Grounds was redone in concrete and steel. That was when Wrigley Field was built. That was when Fenway Park and Braves Field were built. That was the Sportsman's Park in St. Louis was redone. That was one that had been an original spot on wood, and it became concrete and steel. It was when Tiger Stadium was built. All of these parks were built at that time, and they were all basically on the model of Scheib Park. So that was obviously really important. Now, there's one other very important thing about Scheib and the dead ball, but I think we should save that till the end of the show.
Oh, yeah. Now, let me just say something. Well, let me just say something. About 40 years later, when Mac, I think, passed away in the 50s, they renamed it Connie Mack Stadium.
Yes, that is correct. They did, because when I was growing up, I grew up in Chicago, and when I grew up in Chicago, the Cubs were on television all the time. They were one of the first teams that was on television all the time, and that's how I got to love Major League Baseball, was watching baseball. Even though I'm a White Sox fan, I watched the Cubs because they were on. And that's where they went. They went when they played in Philadelphia. They played at Connie Mack Stadium, and it was the same park. It was Scheib Park, but it was renamed as Connie Mack Stadium after he died.
Now, what's interesting about this whole thing is, whereas a few individuals built the Philadelphia A's, the Chicago Cubs had a history going back to 1871. Let's talk about their history with Camp Anson. Let's talk about how they became a powerhouse in the early 20th century, and let's see what was doing by the time they got to 1910.
Well, again, yes, the Cubs started in 1871 was their first year, and that was, I forget the exact name of the team. I think it might have been the league. I think it might have been called the National Association. And that National Association lasted from 1871 to 1875, and the Cubs were in it. By the way, this was in my book. Do you know who? There were two teams in that association, two franchises that still exist. They've operated continuously since then, and they still exist. Do you know what they are?
I'm trying to think. Is it the Milwaukee Brewers?
sort of, no. One has stayed in the same place all the time. The other one has moved twice. One of the places it moved to was Milwaukee.
So one of them's the Braves.
One of them's the Braves. The other's the Cubs. And they were in 1871 the Braves they weren't called the Braves, they were in Boston, and the Cubs, who weren't called the Cubs, were in Chicago. But yes, they were there then. The fellow who owned the Cubs in 1875, named William Hulbert, who's in the Hall of Fame, stole basically the four best players from the Boston team, one of whom was Al Spalding, and brought them to Chicago. Well, the National Association basically got together and said, you can't do that. We're kicking you out of the league. He said, to hell with you, and he started another league. And the other league was the National League. And that started in 1876, which, as far as I'm aware, is the oldest professional sports league in the U.S. And it has been operating continuously. And again, there's only been two teams that have been in it through the entire time, the Cubs and the Braves. And so Al Spalding was the big star at the beginning. He was like the best pitcher. And again, going into sporting goods, that's the fellow that's founded Spalding Sporting Goods, which is still in business. And he founded it with his baseball money. And he eventually, after Hulbert died, he became the owner of the Cubs. But while Hulbert was alive and Spalding was still playing, Cap Anson joined the Cubs. I think he joined the Cubs in 1875 or 76, one of those years. And Cap Anson was a great player, kind of a miserable human being, but a great player. And he became, by about 1880, he became the manager of the Cubs, and he did everything that Connie Mack did, as manager. Now, he had a president who was Al Spalding, who was a baseball guy and who let Anson run it, but, Spalding knew what was going on. He had been a major league player. He was a great pitcher. He's also involved in the sporting goods, so he kept a little more control on him. But the Cubs were great. By the way, here's another good trivia question. Do you know who the champion of the American League and the National League were in their first years? National League was 1876. American League was 1901. And here's a hint. They have the same name. It's the same name all the way through, like you would say Boston Red Sox or Philadelphia Phillies. Same name all the way through. And it's the same name for both teams.
I have no idea.
Chicago White Stockings.
There you go.
The Cubs were called the White Stockings in 1876. The White Sox were called the White Stockings in 1901, and they won the pennant in both of those years. So anyway, that's just a nice little interesting trivia question. But as I said, when Anson got involved there, he was the Cubs were great in the 1870s and the first half of the 1880s. They were the best team in the National League. The American Association had basically started up, I think, around 1880. And the first, could be realistically considered World Series were played. They tried to, and because they were just learning how to do it, they screwed up a couple of times. They got it right a couple of times. But the most famous one was between the National League, Chicago White Stockings, and the American Association, St. Louis Browns, when Anson was running the White Stockings and Charles Comiskey was running the St. Louis Browns. And they had a series, and I think it was 1884 or 1885, which was really famous and big. They did it on a 7-game basis. Turned out to be a really exciting series. Now then, that sort of fell apart right after that. They didn't continue doing it while the American Association was involved. So that was like the precursor of what was World Series. And then Anson, like I said, he was there. He was a great player. And it's something, again, that I learned in doing the research of this book, something that I thought was a very recent development in baseball. Actually, it happened in 1887 to Cap Anson, which was a long-term contract. They gave Cap Anson a 10-year contract in 1887 to play and manage the Cubs. Now, this was after he had been phenomenally successful for 10 years as a player and as a manager. By about 1887, he basically lost his touch as a manager. He was still a great player, but he lost his touch as a manager because he was a farm boy from Iowa, and he had most of the prejudices of farm boys from the Midwest at that time. one of which had to do with African-American players, which was shared by almost everybody back then, almost all white people back then. But he also didn't like Irishmen, and Irishmen dominated the major leagues at that time, and he didn't want any Irishmen on his teams. So his teams didn't get very good. They got quite bad after that. Now, he had Irishmen before 1887, and they were very successful. They were a great team. But he let his prejudices get involved, and the team got bad. And so he lasted until 1880. He fulfilled the contract, as did the Cubs. The 10 years, he was there for 10 more years. When the contract went up, the Cubs let him go. And they were then known for a short period of time as, they were called the Orphans a little bit, because now Cap Anson wasn't there anymore. They were called the Colts for a little bit of time in there, because they had lost the White Stocking name somewhere along the way in the 1890s. And then by the time of the National League, by the time of the American League starting in 1901, the Cubs were pretty lousy. And they were owned at that time by a guy named James Hart, who Cap Anson thought he was supposed to get the team when Spalding sold it. Spalding sold it to concentrate on the sporting good business. And James Hart, who was his business manager, bought the team from Spalding. And Anson didn't like Hart anyway, and he thought Hart had sort of aced him out of owning the team, so they didn't get along. And Hart was the owner there, and he was sort of divided because he also owned a gravel company in Chicago, which was much more profitable than the baseball team. The baseball team was profitable, but the gravel company is where he made his real money. And he wanted to find somebody to take it off his hands and run it. He was trying to run it, and he really wasn't educated. He didn't really know what he was doing. He was trying to run it, but he looked around and he found a guy to run it. And this guy, who, by the way, someone who I didn't really know very much about and learned about in this book, and have gotten to the point where I'm really fascinated by him, and I'm probably going to do my next book on him, was the guy who had been the manager of the Boston Bean Eaters in the 1890s. The Boston Bean Eaters were the best team in the National League in the 1890s. They won 5 pennants as opposed to the Orioles winning 4. And his name is Frank Seeley. Frank Seeley, he and the ownership of Boston fell out in 1901. He was available. Hart hired him in 1902 to become the manager of the Cubs. And he became the manager of the Cubs. Again, he had a great reputation. He was known as the top manager. And he came to the Cubs, and he basically built the team that became the team that's written in this book. Frank Chance was on the team. He had come to Chicago in 1898 as a catcher. He thought he was a catcher. The people that saw him play didn't think he was a catcher. They thought he was a real good ball player, but they didn't think he was a catcher. He just wasn't a very good catcher. And he played that way for 1898, 99, 1900, 1901. And in 1901, another catcher came to the Cubs named John Kling, who basically beat Chase out. And Chase would do other things. He would play the infield and the outfield and all that. Well, when Seeley took over in 1902 and saw them in spring training, he tried to convince Chase to be a first baseman. Chase didn't want to be a first baseman. He wanted to be a catcher. Well, in 1902, he played a lot of different things, a lot of different positions. But he was a very good hitter, and he was an excellent offensive player. And by the time the 1902 season was over, Chase had finally been convinced by Seeley to become a first baseman. In 1902, Seeley also found in a tryout camp Joe Tinker, who was a third baseman. Seeley moved him to shortstop. In 1902, Seeley had brought his second baseman with him from Boston, a guy named Bobby Lowe, who I think is also in the Hall of Fame, great player, but was older. And he got hurt during the season, and Seeley needed a second baseman. He sent out to a friend of his in the East, said, send me the best second baseman you can find. He sent him a guy who showed up. He was 5'6" and 105 pounds, and they all thought he was the bat boy. That was Johnny Evers. And they put him in second base in that time. So the Tinkers Evers, the chance started in 1902. And then Seeley built up more players. In 1902 and 1903, the Cubs were not particularly good. They were getting better, but they were not good. In 1904, they got good. I think they won 95 games or something. The Giants won the pennant easily, but the Cubs were in second, and the Cubs got good in 1904. They got Three Finger Brown in 1904. They got Frank Schulte, who was one of their outfielders in 1904. These were all acquisitions of Seeley. And Seeley was a really good manager. He, like I said, he eventually is in the Hall of Fame. But he was a totally different style of manager from someone like John McGraw. He was more like Connie Mack. He was quiet. He let the players run things themselves. He was great at spotting talent and putting talent into the right place, but he wasn't a fiery leader. And he was also sick. He had tuberculosis, which is, a problem that happened back then, which fortunately we don't see very much of these days. So by 1905, he was not sure he could last much longer. Now, earlier, I think it was in either 03 or 04, I forget which, in spring training, the guy who had been the captain the year before, had retired or left the team. So they were going to have a new captain. Being a captain back then, which we can talk about later, was very important. It's really more of the manager on the field than the manager was, particularly if as a manager like both Connie Mack and Frank Seeley, and that these guys sat in the dugout with their suits on. They didn't go out on the field and argue with people. They didn't go to the pitcher's mound. They sat in the dugout and didn't do other things. So the captain ran the team on the field. Well, normally the captain is named by the manager. Well, Seeley decided to do it democratically. Said, we'll elect one. And he backed a guy that he had just gotten from Boston, a guy he had it in Boston as a player. And, as it turned out, three guys wanted it. This guy from Boston, John Kling, who was the catcher, and Frank Chance. And they had an election, and Chance won. And so obviously the other players respected him, and Chance became the captain. And then in 1905, the Cubs were in the process of being sold to a new owner. And it's debatable whether Seeley left just because he was sick or whether he left because he was pushed. I tend to think he was because he was sick. I mean, tuberculosis is a serious disease. And he moved after that. Right after that, he moved to Denver, which was thought to be a place that was conducive to tubercular patients recovering. So, I mean, he obviously was sick, and he died of tuberculosis a couple of years later. So, but at that point, Chance became the manager. He was already the captain. He was already running the team on the field, and he was a great player between 1902 and 1906. He was, without question, the best first baseman in baseball at that time. So he became the manager in August of 1905. And in 1905, again, the Cubs had a very good year. The Giants won the pennant. They won the pennant easily, but the Cubs I think they won 94 or 95 games. They had a very good year. And then so in 1906, Chance takes over. He does a couple of things, gets a guy named Jimmy Sheckard from Brooklyn, gets a couple of pitchers, Orville Overall and Ed Rulbach. And in 1916, the Cubs have the best regular season ever by anybody since 1900. There may have been people that were better in the 19th century, but the Cubs had the best regular season ever by winning percentage, 116 and 36. The only other team to win 116 games in a regular season were the Mariners in 2001. It took them 162 games. The Cubs did it in 152 games. So they obviously had a better winning percentage. And as you pointed out at the beginning of the show, they lost the World Series to the White Sox. One of the first times that one could come up with the saying or whatever that anything can happen in a short series. Well, it can. The Cubs were a better team than the White Sox, and they lost. I mean, that happens. And so they came back the next year with the same team, won 111 games, won the World Series in 5 games, came back pretty much with the same team in 1908. They were adding a couple of guys, but nobody really important except for Solly Hoffman, who was their utility man and was probably the best utility man in baseball at that time. And in 1908, you and many other people, I'm sure, have read books about the 1908 pennant race, which was probably the best one ever in both leagues at the same time. And the Cubs won that one and if we want to talk about the Merkle game and things like that, we can do it. But they won, I think they won 99 games that year. In 1909, they came back and won 104 games, but the Pirates won 110, so they finished second. And so then we get to 1910. So they were in the midst of what is the greatest 10-year run of regular season success ever in Major League Baseball after 1900, after the two leagues formed after 1901. From 1904 to 1913, the Cubs hold the record for most wins in every number of seasons, consecutive seasons, between 1 and 10. And it's the same team that did it. And that same team pretty much stayed together the whole time.
And you know what's interesting? The Cubs would not return to the World Series, I think, for another 19 years. I think the A's beat them again in 1929.
Well, there was, except for World War I, they made it in 1918.
Yeah, and they lost.
They lost to the Babe Ruth and the Red Sox. That was when Ruth was the star as a pitcher of the Red Sox.
Now, you know what's interesting? Because 1910 was pretty much the last good season for most of these guys. Evers and Mordecai Brown and even Frank Jansen would be on his way out. I think a few years later he would go to the Yankees. Whereas now Mac has this very young team.
That's right.
You know, and you know, we're on a collision now. What's supposed to be the World Series. Well, let me ask you this question. Were the Chicago Cubs favored to win the 1910 World Series?
The way I see it, yes, overall. Now, again, in my research, my research was basically, obviously in 1910 there was no such thing as a Vegas line coming out. So, you know, I don't know I don't know what the main bookmakers in New York were doing. I do know in Chicago they were favored. In Philadelphia, the A's were favored, which one would kind of make sense. That does make sense. But the understanding that I got from just reading around was that most people thought that the Cubs were favored just on the basis of, hey, this is the first time the A's are there. We don't know what they're going to do. This is the fourth time for the Cubs. We know what they're going to do. So, you know, obviously some people thought, particularly people in the American League who had seen the A's play all year, thought, yeah, these guys are really good. They probably will win. But I think they were favored, probably not hugely, but I think they were favored. As a matter of fact, I can tell you a little story about that. My original title of this book, which was, I finished it before last year's World Series, and I submitted it probably in June of last year. My original title of it was The Last Time the Cubs Were Favored in the World Series. Obviously, last year the Cubs were favored in the World Series, but I submitted the book before then, and the publisher quite correctly changed the title.
Yeah, that's funny. And yeah, you know what's even more enlightening when you read your epilogue and you see that Mac didn't take the credit. He gave it to third base coach Davis over there.
Yeah, well, and actually Davis at that time, and again, this goes back to what I talked about, the captaincy, when Chance became the captain before he became the manager. Mac was, when Mac played, he was a captain. You know, he was often the captain because he was thought to be the smartest guy on the team and knew the most about baseball. And when Mac was captain, his manager let Mac run the team on the field. And Mac did the same thing when he became a manager if he had a captain he trusted. Now, obviously, he didn't always have a captain he trusted, but he trusted Harry Davis. Harry Davis, who was the first baseman that year. That 1910 was Harry Davis's last year as a full-time player. He was a very good player, and he had been a very good player since about 1897 or something. He had first played for Mac in 1898 in Pittsburgh. And Mac had been his manager for a long time. He had been his manager in Pittsburgh for a short time, and then he'd been his manager in Philadelphia for about 8 years before 1910. And Davis had been his captain for a while, and Mac let him run the team on the field. Davis gave the signals. Davis would, you know, make signals into Mac saying, you know, this pitcher's losing it. He'd do all of this stuff. And Mac really did not get involved much at that time. Now, he may have changed later in his career, but at that time, he did not get involved much in play on the field. He did his coaching in the dugout. He would move fielders around occasionally. That was one thing he did do. But he let the captain do that. Now, the Cubs did the same thing. It just so happened that their captain was the manager. You know, Frank Chance was a playing manager, so the manager was on the field doing all of this stuff when he played. And another thing that I found very interesting that I didn't know this until I did the research, Chance, by this point of his career, as you say, 1910 was his last real year of playing. But Chance had a problem all throughout his career with injuries. He got hit in the head a lot. He got hit by pitches a lot. Of course, this was before helmets, so he had problems with that. In this year, he played 88 games, so he played about half the year. And a lot of times, when he wasn't playing, he just didn't show up. You know, he wouldn't come to the game. I think he had headaches that really bothered him, and he would be sick from time. But maybe half the time he didn't play, he wasn't there, and he would basically tell somebody else to run the team, usually Evers, and that person would be the manager that day. And they would run the team on the field and in the dugout. So I mean, it was a totally different thing from the way games are played now, where they're so micromanaged. Basically, the players played, and the players also ran things on the field.
Yeah, that's why back then you had a lot of player managers.
Yes, that's correct. Like both of these guys were player managers. I mean, Mack wasn't a player manager in 1910, but he had been in the 1890s, and Chance still was.
It must have been really funny because Matt. I mean, think of it. Philadelphia summers, sweltering over 100 degrees.
Yeah.
This guy's hanging around with like a wool suit,
with a wool suit and a collar that he had to have. By the time he retired, they had to be specially made for him because they had stopped making them.
I mean, think of how that guy sweated on the field, but he always thought such a different attitude, Mac took. I can't say enough about Mac. I think. By the way, how long did it take you to research this stuff and put the book together?
I would say it took me about a year. I made a trip to the Hall of Fame, and that was about a week, and just looked up as much as I could there. Hall of Fame has files on every player that's ever played in the big leagues, and I looked up the files on all of these guys and learned what I could from that. And then the nice thing here, where I live, like you said, is the home of the University of Illinois. The University of Illinois has a really good library, and I was able to get newspapers for both of these cities for the whole year. So I just read every newspaper article going from basically about October of the year before through about the end of 1910. And one of the things that I do mention in my book, and I don't know if we were going to talk about it, but I'll mention it here. What I thought was really great that I didn't realize this until I got into the research. I certainly knew who this writer was, but I didn't realize that in 1910, I grew up in Chicago, and the Chicago Tribune used to switched their writers every year. They used to switch them at the All-Star break when I was growing up. One would cover the Cubs in the first half and the White Sox in the second half, and the other guy would do the same thing. And they did that back then, too. Well, the first half of the 1910 season, the byline on the Chicago Tribune was R.W. Lardner, which was Ring Lardner. So I got to read 6 months worth of stories by Ring Lardner. That's a joy. It really is.
I know, right?
So.
Well, you know what? It's because the Chicago Tribune, mostly what it's worth now, a lot of this newspapers have been digitalized.
Yeah.
So if you go to newspapers.com, I think for a small fee it opens you up to all this stuff, but Chicago Tribune is free, and I was able to tap into the archives for December 26th and January 27th to find out everything I needed to know about Commissioner Landis and Ban Johnson and that whole squabble with and they gave the full article. And not only did they give you the newspaper, but you click a button and the online site actually gives you all the words.
Right.
Newspaper article. So it's a little different. I'm going to end the show like this, Richard. Tell me the last thing about Amos Strunk, because we can't end without Amos Strunk, who was part of that 1910 Philadelphia Athletics.
Yeah, Amos Strunk was he was a young guy. He was even younger than Eddie Collins and Home Run Baker, and Mack had found him, and he kept him on the bench for the 1909 season, which Mack liked to do. obviously there was no farm system back then, so he would get young guys and he would basically just keep them on the team and keep them sitting next to him on the bench, and he would tell them about things. Well, Mac did that for 1909. In 1910, he expected Strunk to be one of his outfielders. In spring training, Strunk got hurt in a drill, in a pickoff drill. As they said in the papers back then, they said he wrenched his knee. Well, he wrenched his knee enough so that he couldn't play till September. So, they didn't have things like torn ACLs or ligament damage. They didn't know that back then. But obviously it was something like that. It was obviously some serious knee injury where he couldn't play till September. By September, he had healed up and he played a little bit. He played like 10 or 12 games in September, and he was on the World Series roster, and he played in the World Series. And then after that, in like you said, for the rest of this great run with the A's, he was the center fielder in 1911, 12, 13, and 14. And so he was a very, and then I think after that he might have been on the Red Sox in 1918. I think he won one more World Series. He had a good-sized Major League Baseball career. Then he became, after he retired, he became an insurance salesman in Philadelphia. He went back to Philadelphia, became an insurance salesman, and lived there, was successful, happy, no problems. And then he had been present. He was on the team in 1909 when Shibe Park opened. So, he was there. I don't think he played. He was just on the team. And then when they finally built the Veterans Stadium in Philadelphia, and I forget exactly what year this was. I would guess it was in the late 60s, early 70s. It would have been 69, 70, 71, somewhere.
70. It was the year I was born.
Okay. So in 1970, they built Veterans Stadium. Veterans Stadium was ready to open up in Philadelphia. And that year before, which I presume would have been the end of 69, that was the last games in Connie Mack Stadium, which had originally been Shibe Park. And the last game, they had a ceremony like they do in these parks when they know that they're not going to be there anymore. And they basically were trying to find people to come, and they wanted Amos Strunk to come and throw out the first ball because he was the last living participant who had been a player in the original game at Shibe Park. And he lived in the area. It wasn't like it was a big hardship for him to come there. He lived in Philadelphia. And he basically said, hell no.
I wonder why.
I don't know exactly. I just know that's what, that's the article that I read about it, which I actually found in the Hall of Fame, basically said he just didn't want to be involved. And so he didn't go. I don't know that he was mad. I don't know if he was mad at the Phillies because obviously it wasn't his team. I don't know any of that. I just know he just decided he didn't want to go, and he didn't. He was in his 90s, so they weren't going to drag him there or anything. But yeah, that was kind of a neat little story, which I would have never found if I hadn't gone to the Hall of Fame and looked it up.
You know what's interesting? We're going to give it an asterisk. We're going to give it an asterisk right now, today, in McFarland, at McFarland. As I was speaking to you, I got the listing of new books that are coming out.
Uh-huh.
And Lou Friedman was on my show about the 48 Cleveland Indians. Of course, you have, Lou Boudreau, who was the player manager at the time, and you had Satchel Paige, and you had, you had all those guys who won the 48. His new book comes out today, which I know I'm going to get because I had Lou on the show. And if you don't know who Lou was, he was the prize-winning journalist for the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Chicago Tribune, and the Anchor.
I remember reading him when I was growing up, or when I was reading it, not growing up, we're probably about the same age, but I remember reading him in Chicago.
And he came out with a book today. When your book leaves off, his book begins. Connie Mack's First Dynasty, the Philadelphia Athletics, 1910 to 1914. Very, very eerie that I'm doing this show. And McFarland, because I get all their newsletters, sends me this and says, look, we're going to send you Lou Friedman's book. So I'm going to have Friedman on the show. We're going to pick it up, of course, with his book. But in the meantime, we could find your book on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. We could find it on McFarland. Where else can we find it?
Those are the three places that I'm aware of. I'm not aware of anything else, but if anybody else does see it, let me know. And if anybody wants to get a copy from me, they can also get one from me. But yeah, Amazon. I know it's on Amazon. I know it's on Barnes and Noble, and I know it is on McFarlane. So
all right, it's a good book. Hang on to the line. I'm going to end the show, and then I'll talk to you a little after the show, folks. This is a great book, and I'm not going to just say it's a great book about the particular time period, but the most important thing you'll get out of this book is the whole early creation and formation of baseball. It's not only the story of the 1910 season, it's a lot more of it. It gets all the good players of, the early period and the politics. Like we mentioned on the show, we got Ben Scheib, we got Connie Mack, Eddie Collins, who ended up being on the Chicago White Sox, the Black Sox scandal.
Yep.
Frank Baker, the home run Baker, he went to the Yankees, I think, after Chief Bender and many others. Go out, get this book, because it is that important. And I'll tell you, Richard writes really, really clear, concise, easy to read. Go get this book for the holidays. I highly recommend it. Thank you so much, Richard, for being on the show. As always, I am Ian Kahanowitz. I'm in for the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. And in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.